Hey everyone, I'm Black Lightning, the alternative hypothesis response. After our Twitter exchange, I concluded that I should move on and focus on other things. I never begged him to respond. I just pointed out him contradicting what he said with his actions. So someone decided to bug him and his followers, which I didn't approve of. I believe their alternative hypothesis blocked the person, and then they created an alternative account to continue talking to him and his followers. I know who owns that account, and I told the person to stop because based on his actions, people have reasonable suspicion to think that account belongs to me. You have to take my word that the person wasn't me. I talked to the person and they agreed to let me handle the interactions between us too. I forgave the person and we moved on. I'm going to cover the response honestly with civility. To start things off, he points out that the gap between him and Ritterman, which calculated the IQ scores based on the NAEP scores, which I linked, and showed that the gap between them is insignificant despite the different numbers. That was a mistake on my part, and I conceded there. I should have paid more attention, but now that's one less error from me in the future. I still suspect you didn't use a formula, and I still prefer Ritterman's numbers over yours, but I did overestimate the error. I'm still standing by me proving your interpretation of the two sources you linked to explain why there's a decrease in the gap over the years to be highly flawed. You didn't even mention that part. Funding is often tied to the scores. Black schools fudge exclude a large proportion of their students from the test. This source doesn't say anything specific about schools with predominantly black students. It just lists exclusion rates based on various cities. The second and biggest problem is you fail to mention that this is about students in special education and English language learner programs, not students in general. Why did you make this source out to be something it's not? Your second explanation for the closing gap is that students in low-performing urban school districts would cheat. I clicked the source you used to support yourself, and once again, this is about students in special education and ELL programs. It also says cheating the NAEP, not cheating on the NAEP. While you didn't explicitly say black students would cheat, the way you worded your paragraphs and the name you gave your sources implied such a thing. Once again, feel free to explain yourself. If I'm wrong, tell me.
One thing he says right off the bat is that he doesn't know whether race realism is correct or incorrect.
Since we don't have conclusive data for this topic, I can't say they are wrong with absolute certainty.
But then he makes several positive claims that heavily imply no race differences.
It also means that comparison of test scores from persons with widely different life experiences and cognitive habits is not an expression of their relative innate potentials. Way to take things out of context. Yes, there should be racial differences because we are able to create categories based on the biodiversity of humanity. No matter where you draw the line, there should be enough differences to make comparisons between. The clip of me talking about intelligence, IQ, G, and IQ test was me explaining why IQ tests aren't completely accurate. You spliced multiple different sections of my video together to make it seem as if the clips you showed of me talking about intelligence, the disparity of the socioeconomic status, and the black-white IQ gap was done so in reference to racial differences. You could tell by the background, the scenery changes throughout the video. Cloudy skies for race, rain to clear skies for intelligence itself, and a transition to reddish-orange skies for the black-white IQ gap. It's something I did to highlight when I'm making another argument. Also, the IQ statistics only address the differences between self-identified race and IQ scores. Anything about genes is indirect. This is very disappointing, and I wish you could have addressed my arguments properly.
Appear unbiased, he'll sometimes go after Kangs from time to time, but nobody listens to Kangs. But he never goes after the equalists, he never goes after the secular creationists.
Secular creationist? That's a new one. If you paid attention to my video, I argued against people saying that everything could be explained by the environment. The first timestamp I'm showing is at the beginning of my video and hard to miss. My position is nuanced and you fail to recognize that. I didn't make a big deal about them because they seem to be few and far between. I meet more people saying the IQ and behavioral differences could be explained mostly by genes than I do people who say everything could be explained by the environment. So yes, my priority will be on the genetic determinists. Genetics and the environment will always play a role in a trait. So you address my points in which I say race is a social construct but it's based on the observable differences in humanity. I was excited at first because I thought you were going to be honest, but you found some way to spin it into making it seem as if I'm denying race.
And puppies who believe in some hard either-or absolute categorical delineation of these things are just dummies who believe in Star Trek science. Let's go ahead and just look at the Wikipedia definition of subspecies. Quote,
I want to address Wikipedia's definition of subspecies. I looked on Wikipedia to get context, and this is where the quote, "the alternative hypothesis" used. So zoologists, botanists, and microbiologists can use subspecies, race, or populations interchangeably as subspecies. The problem here is if you click the link above to direct you to race, it explains that in biological taxonomy, race is an informal rank in a taxonomic hierarchy below the level of subspecies. This is conflicting information, but it's to be expected given the nature of Wikipedia. However, I'm more inclined to agree with this page given my sources. I won't call you deceiving for this because this seems like an honest mistake. It's the people who added to Wikipedia's fault, if anything. You can make a category based on our differences on the genetic and phenotypic level for research purposes, but it doesn't make it a scientific classification.
Isn't this nice? So what's up, Black Lightning? Are we coming or going?
Here's the problem here. You fail to understand the context of me using scientific classification. I meant it as in taxonomic status. We are Homo sapiens sapien, and that's as far as it goes. Race is below the subspecies level, which means it isn't recognized as a scientific classification. You can, however, make classifications for research purposes, but it doesn't validate it as an official taxonomic status. You also didn't bring up me saying race has predictive power because race is often highly correlated to geographic regions. You also mock me for bringing up the fact that there is more genetic variation within populations than between them.
Well, let's look at the work of Matashi Nai, the real science guy, on chimpanzees. Here's heterozygosity compared to genetic distance, and the races in red are the ones which have less genetic variation within than they do between their populations and chimpanzees. You can also model the sexes as an FST distance if you want, because it's just an allele frequency of 100% at the Y chromosome and the deactivated X chromosome analogs, so we can point to more variation within than between the sexes as well. What does this mean? Very little. Isn't this fun?
It just seems as if you're resorting to non sequiturs to make my argument meaningless. This doesn't refute the point I made, which was to give an explanation that we are more alike than different. I didn't point that out to explain why race is not real. So bringing up these points don't refute the fact that there is more genetic variation within human populations than between. That's a problem with many race realists. You're so focused on what makes us different that if someone points out how similar we are overall, you get upset. I am not bringing this up to say race don't exist, so please calm down. The next argument he addressed to mine was me talking about genetic clusters.
So he cites this study, BAMSHAD 2004, which only found a correspondence between self-identified race and best fit cluster of around 62%. Now, given that BAMSHAD used 3 clusters, pure chance would be 33%, so this still wouldn't be a horrible result. And I just realized, of course he's going to get a ton of overlap because he's only using 3 clusters for literally all of human genetic variation. In fact, the choice of using 3 clusters seems to be designed to produce this kind of overlap, which he can then come around and wave his arms and say, oh look, race doesn't exist.
So he says the research was designed like this to produce an overlap as a way to say race doesn't exist. The point of the source I linked wasn't to show race doesn't exist, neither did the original source itself, but rather the limitations and flaws of such a concept. Race is not perfect, but it is a real category nonetheless.
However, BAMSHAD 2004 is an outlier compared to the 8 other cluster analyses I cited in my article on the existence of race, all of which had a correspondence between self-ID and best fit cluster of over 95%, including earlier work from BAMSHAD himself, which found over 99% correspondence.
I'm going to start with BAMSHAD's early work from 2003. The problem here is that I don't disagree. I specifically said that concepts of race are highly correlated to geographic ancestry. With that being said, I agree that you should be able to find genetic clusters from human populations which correspond to geographic regions. You should be able to identify this relationship easily. However, you're not telling the full story by leaving it at that. Further down in the same source you linked, it says our analysis is based on samples from regions of Africa, Asia, and Europe that are widely separated from one another. The performance of these markers to differentiate among populations from these continents would be reduced if samples were included from regions geographically intermediate between the regions sampled here. Importantly, the inclusion of such samples demonstrates geographic continuity and the distribution of genetic variation, and this undermines traditional concepts of race. I specifically said this in the previous video. Think about this carefully. It would actually help you if there were just 3 genetic clusters being sampled: African, East Asian, and European. You can make discrete races by doing this. You thought this hurts your point, but it actually helps you because if you add more human populations into the mix, you'll see the genetic variation within humanity becoming more continuous. Also, this doesn't disprove race, but rather shows how flawed and limited our traditional view of it is. Based on that concept, you're going to find individuals in a race to be more similar to individuals from another race than their own. You think this is all conflicting information, but they can all coexist. Race is real, but not perfect. You can't just cherry-pick statistics from studies without context. Please read the researcher's notes if you're going to cite it. Granted, you're smart, but you didn't do the research yourself. You're in the same predicament as I am, so you might as well read the source in its entirety to understand what the research is about. It might not be saying what you think it's saying. Other than that, if you say we can correctly identify geographic ancestry based on DNA samples, I agree with you 100%. However, this doesn't change the fact that the genetic diversity of humanity is distributed as clines across geographic regions. Also, in the introduction of that same source you cited, they do the dreaded more variation within populations than between them thing. You have the choice to continue cherry-picking or disregard this source entirely because you found out you misinterpreted it. I'm going to address two more sources because I think they're going to say the same thing as my sources along with the source you cited. In the source from Alico from 2007, it's saying the same thing. I agree that we are able to identify a person's geographic ancestry based on DNA samples. I even used a source in my video which says 6 main genetic clusters correspond to geographic regions. I don't disagree with that at all. Although it didn't say anything about continuous genetic variation, it's not saying anything I disagree with. The source was about letting people know that we can identify a person's continent of origin based on DNA samples. Your next source from Lau in 2010 says the same thing. We can identify the geographic ancestry of human populations based on DNA samples. It also says another thing I agree with. Self-identified race is highly correlated with geographic ancestry. That's the nature of such a concept. Despite its limitations, you will have predictive power, whether it be for potential diseases or identify geographic ancestry. I'm sorry if it seems as if I'm repeating myself, but people like you are going to make it seem as if I'm denying race or disregarding the facts about human biology, and then your audience will eat it up. It's not true, and an apology would be the mature thing to do. I thought I would have to dig deeper on race, but you and your sources never refuted my main argument. You only strengthened it.
The last thing we should look at on race denial is Black Lightning's claim that we're all confused and have radically different ideas about race.
What happens next is, based on your cultural perception of race, you pick the race. This is another attempt by you to take what I've said out of context. That part of the video was about forensic and physical anthropologists. I didn't direct that to race realists. They are studying a person's remains to identify their geographic ancestry, and based on their cultural perception of race, we can attach a race based on the geographic region the DNA samples seem to originate from. This is just misleading. There is, however, one slight error I made here. While it's true that a casual Brazilian may have their unique view on race, anthropologists in Brazil perceive race in a way that's similar to how Americans perceive it. Even though it's similar, there are still small differences about what a racial group covers. As you said yourself, their perception of white could include admixture from another racial group. Even so, your main point in bringing this up was to make it seem as if I said everyone is confused about race, but that wasn't true. Also, humans are wired to find patterns and create ways to identify such patterns. I'm not disputing early humans being able to do so with human populations with enough phenotypic differences, so I agree with you there.
Black Lightning goes into a bunch of things he thinks explain the racial IQ gaps. One thing he brings up is the bad school myth.
Are you serious? Are you trying to imply that every school in America have the same learning environment? I can't believe you're saying this is a myth. Even in one of your articles, you mentioned that there are low-performing urban schools. That implies there are high-performing schools out there, but fine, I'm going to explain why not all schools are equal. In this source it says, previous research has suggested that students from schools with high concentrations of low-income students and students from urban schools would have less supportive family backgrounds, less favorable school experiences, and less successful educational outcomes than students from other schools. This study provides evidence that students in urban schools are more likely than those in other locations to have characteristics such as poverty, difficulty speaking English, and numerous health and safety risks that present greater challenges to them and their educators. Since the source spans across 1980 to 1990, I looked for one that was closer to the present. In 2013, the high school graduation rates were lower in urban areas than in the suburbs. It's the same in Chicago. Also, not all schools spend the same amount of money per student. With some school districts spending more money than others, there's going to be gaps between them over time. The problem with a school funding system that relies so heavily on local property taxes is straightforward. Property values vary a lot from neighborhood to neighborhood, district to district, and with them, tax revenues. To help poorer schools compensate for that local imbalances, some states have stepped in. May is the principal of Livingston Junior High School in rural western Alabama. Most of its students come from low-income families. Sumter County is farm country, and what isn't farmland is timberland. In Alabama, both are lightly taxed. Then the person gives pictures of the school to show the results of this. These pictures are examples of how bad things can get if a school isn't receiving proper funding. Further down it says, one room, no longer a classroom, leaks when it rains. Garbage cans collect some of the water, but the buckled floor and smell of mold suggest they miss plenty. Around the school there are broken windows, peeling paint, and cracked floors. This isn't just a black student problem, but black students are more likely to attend schools such as these. Here it says one nurse commutes between 3 schools, and the 2 elementary schools share an art teacher and a music teacher. Some schools can't even afford to hire multiple teachers of their own, let alone experienced teachers. In this source, it shows the starting salaries for teachers varies by state. More experienced teachers or teachers with higher degrees make more money. So if a school can't afford these more experienced teachers, they are stuck with entry-level teachers. Or they may not have enough entry-level teachers to begin with. Further down in that previous source, as of 2014, the most recent year of available census data, 35 states were still spending less overall per student than they did in 2008. Why does that matter? Because state dollars on average accounts for nearly half of a school's revenues. The other major source of funding comes from local governments. I really hope this paints a picture that there are bad schools and good schools. Otherwise, I don't know what to tell you. It's like telling you the sky is blue, but you insist it's green.
Well, we have lottery voucher studies, where students that both qualify for a voucher and apply for a voucher. One student gets the voucher, the other doesn't, and they end up with the same GPAs, and more important to our discussion about IQ, the same standardized test score, whether they get the voucher and go to the good school, quote unquote, or not.
The big problem here is that you don't give the demographic of who receives such vouchers and whether or not they work as intended. So I'm going to do your work for you and explain why bringing this up doesn't disprove the existence of bad schools. Here's the demographics of the voucher program based on the Indiana Department of Education. White people greatly overshadow black people in this program. Their rates continue to rise as black people's continue to lower. The program was once premised on giving low-income, public school families access to better schools. This year, fewer than 1% of voucher students used a pathway written into the law that's meant specifically for students leaving failing schools. Most likely your statistics were just comparing students in good private schools to students in good public schools. This hardly disproves bad schools.
Next, he brings up the toxic internal culture myth.
Jeez, are you going to call every reasonable contradicting information a myth?
Okay, well, first off, blacks and Hispanics are more likely to say that they care about going to college than whites. So that's one sign they value school more.
Yes, I expect black people to place more value on it because if you're at the bottom, you're going to place more importance on things you believe will help you reach the top. But the results are different than words. I looked at the source you got that chart from, and while it's true that black and Hispanic people place great importance on college degrees and educational attainment, and college enrollment have increased for them, they still lag behind other groups. Among adults ages 25 to 29, 63% of Asians, 41% of whites, 22% of blacks, and 15% of Hispanics have earned at least a bachelor's degree in 2014. Once again, results are different than words. I can say I'm going to be the best player in a fighting game, but it doesn't necessarily mean that will become true.
Also, the races have roughly the same GPAs for given SAT scores. So it's not like blacks do bad in school, but then suddenly when they take the SAT, they do way better on the SAT. There's no divergence here. So it looks like Hispanics and blacks apply themselves to the same degree for a given level of ability as proxied by SAT scores.
No, there's still a racial gap in SAT scores. You didn't put any statistics on your screen during that part, and that would have helped you.
The result is higher dropout rates for these groups, which is what you would expect given the differences in ability levels, but a similar desire to go to college. All this points to blacks and Hispanics valuing school to the same degree or perhaps even more than whites, and the anti-intellectual culture or toxic internal culture thing just looks like another myth.
You talk about different abilities to complete college and dropout rates. Since you didn't really disprove my toxic culture and anti-intellectual explanation, your conclusion that it must be due to innate cognitive abilities fall flat here. Talking about the desire to go to college enrollment rates, along with the college dropout rates, hardly touches the toxic culture that's prevalent among many black people. You're basically isolating one social component from many others, and then saying this proves the other social components are myths, without realizing they all influence each other. I'm surprised no one challenged you on this. You then talk about me bringing up different socioeconomic mobility rates between the races.
I'm not sure what his point with this is supposed to be, but this is actually explained by regression toward the mean. Basically, for a given IQ, the next generation will regress about halfway toward the racial average on average. And when IQ is controlled for, the races have about the same median income. And so regression to the mean in income is just a reflection of regression to the mean in the cognitive traits that IQ measures. I'm not sure what point Black Lightning is trying to make about race differences in economic mobility. I'm sure it has something to do with oppression.
I flashed a source on the screen prior to that part because I thought people would pause the screen to read it or click the link in the source, but I'll actually read the parts of it now. Characteristics not commonly measured in studies of cognitive and dementia, such as literacy and financial adequacy, in addition to age, sex, and education, were significantly associated with cognitive scores and helped explain the differences in scores between older black and white adults. The score differential diminished to a greater extent for the 3MS than the DSS test, possibly indicating that socioeconomic indicators affect deficits in cognitive domains such as memory and language more than attention and visual spatial abilities do. The current findings clearly indicate that socioeconomic factors such as education, literacy, income, and financial adequacy not only have an independent association with cognitive performance, but also explain a substantial amount of the difference in cognitive testing between older blacks and whites. This is the point I was making when bringing up socioeconomic status. It's one of many variables involved. You and many race realists forced a stigma on these explanations so you can overlook valid environmental and historical factors. This next part is pretty much a clash between socioeconomic status influences IQ versus socioeconomic status is a reflection of IQ. The people on the outside might ask, okay, which proves which is correct? Although more research is needed, I personally believe socioeconomic status influences IQ because if someone is born into a poor family with little opportunities and they never receive the help or knowledge to move up in life, to say they are poor because of low IQ is not convincing to me. Here's the thing. If you think socioeconomic status is the reflection of IQ, then doesn't that imply that socioeconomic status and IQ are positively correlated? The higher the IQ, the higher your socioeconomic status, the lower the IQ, the lower your socioeconomic status. Even if arguing the other side of my point, you're supporting a positive correlation as I am. With this being said, there's not really anything stopping me from saying the higher the socioeconomic status, the higher the IQ. The lower the socioeconomic status, the lower the IQ. Once you've established that positive correlation, you've made my point much more believable. Now I'm going to address using IQ as a predictor of life outcomes. In this study, it questions whether or not IQ can predict job performance. While you can make correlations between IQ and educational achievement, occupational level, and job performance, saying IQ predict your status in them is a bit misguided. The correlation between IQ and school achievements may emerge because the tests demand the very kinds of learned linguistic and cognitive structures in schooling. School achievement is a strong determinant of your level of entry in the job market, including salary, so it makes sense that IQ will also have a correlation with income. But to say IQ is the predictor of income or your income is the reflection of your IQ is flawed because it's not as clear-cut as that. No employer is looking for your IQ on your resume, but your educational achievements is one of the required criteria you need to present. Also, job performance ratings are subjective and inconsistent because they are based on the supervisor's discretion. Pointing out the limitations of IQ doesn't mean I believe IQ should be dismissed. You also just showed a statistic with a ratio gap in SAT scores, so how can you say they scored roughly the same earlier?
Also, the races have roughly the same GPAs for given SAT scores.
Maybe I'm missing something here, but this seems contradicting.
This regression to the mean is related to additive heritability, which gets us into genome-wide association studies, or the GWASs. Black Lightning in his video said that GWASs imply a heritability of 50% for IQ for people in the United States. This is just additive heritability. GWASs cannot find non-additive genetic effects. That's why they say that these are lower bound estimates for the overall heritability of IQ.
Small nitpick, I never said the United States. I figured it meant humans in general. For this part, you make it very hard for people to validate what you're saying for ourselves. It doesn't help that your method of citing sources is inconvenient. For those who don't know, additive genetic variance is a portion of phenotypic variance, which is due to the additive effect of genes. It determines how different an offspring is to their parents because the addition of alleles inherited from parent to offspring will add on to the genetic variation of a trait. For future reference, non-additive genetic variance results from interactions between genes. And yes, the genome-wide association studies refer to additive genetic variation. I guess it was a minor error on my part for not mentioning additive genetic variation, but I don't see how that changes the overall point to that part of the video.
Now, based on twin studies, we know the heritability of IQ for adults, after correcting for test-retest unreliability, is about 80%. So additive heritability is 50%, non-additive heritability is about 30%, and variation in environment explains about 20% of variation in IQ in the United States.
I cited a source that says heritability is 50 to 80% across many age groups and 60 to 80% at old age based on twin studies. Of course, you'd jump to the highest number. I will have to point out that twin studies may not be as reliable as I thought. Twin studies seem to rely on theoretical assumptions, one of which is same-sex dizygotic and monozygotic twin pairs grow up experiencing roughly the same environments, also known as equal environments assumption. Since identical twins experience more similar environments than same-sex fraternal twins, this means all conclusions in favor of genetics are false. Leading twin researchers admitted to this flaw in the 1960s, but twin researchers attempted to validate the twin method by redefining the equal environment assumption. Even with this, it's still based on an assumption that identical twins behave similarly because they are genetically similar. There are factors such as more similar treatment, greater environmental similarity, strong attachment and bond to each other, and feeling as if they are two halves of the same whole. This means we should take the heritability estimates based on twin studies with a grain of salt for now, because what differences could be due to environmental factors could be assumed to be genetic, and thus overestimates the heritability of a trait. Since my source about the exact percentages of heritability of IQ by age was based primarily on twin studies, I will be hesitant about agreeing with the exact estimates from that source. I'm not denying heritability increases with age, but I'm now unsure of the exact estimates. I'm going to quickly talk about transracial adoption studies because they operate similar enough. And this study explains that the apparent IQ advantage of East Asian adoptees is an artifact caused by ignoring the Flynn effect and adoption's beneficial effect on IQ. It basically suggests that if East Asians, white, and black adoptees were raised in the same environment, they would have similar IQs, hinting at a minimal role for genes in racial IQ differences.
And with IQ, the effects of the environment your parents provide fades out to zero. This isn't to say that parenting doesn't matter, it's just to say that currently extant variation in parenting doesn't really explain any variation in adult IQ in the population of the United States.
I talked about heritability of IQ having this similar rising trend as a person aged despite genetic stability. It's called genetic amplification, and if you're not using your genetic base for intelligence at its highest potential, then this process for you might not work as effective as it does supposedly in general. This doesn't mean genes play little role in a person's intelligence than someone else, because I believe the genes responsible for intelligence have a constant influence on intelligence. I think of it as a muscle. If you're not able to use it effectively, then you won't be as intelligent as someone else who is. The environmental factors will determine whether or not you're going to use your genetic base for intelligence at its highest potential. Whether this genetic base for intelligence is the same for everyone is unknown as of now. It's definitely plausible, but not confirmed, and especially not confirmed in regards to races.
And this is how regression to the mean happens in the United States. Each generation, 50% of the variation in IQ comes from your genes, which you get from your parents, then 30% comes from the non-additive genetic effects, which are functionally random, and then 20% comes from environment, which is functionally random. That's why you get regression to the mean in whatever cognitive traits it is IQ is measuring, and consequently, regression to the mean in median incomes.
I've heard you mention regression to the mean before, so I'm going to address it now. I really don't see a problem with it. It's something to consider in statistics to avoid making incorrect inferences. The problems only lie with how you're using it. For one, I don't think the average IQ of any population remains the same, and in fact, I believe the lower averages of Black and Hispanic people have been increasing given my sources. The reason why I believe you rely on regression to the mean is because you believe the average IQ of Black people hasn't risen or the change has been insignificant. Remember, the closing gap trend of the NAEP score still remains because you failed to disprove it, and I also have another source that indicates the same thing. Once again, wherever your biases lie will determine which scenario you choose to follow. The second problem is that your numbers are based on heritability estimates from twin studies, and I'm hesitant to agree with them because of the problems I mentioned. The 50% additive genetic variance is okay because it was based on the genome-wide association study. The other two, I'm not too sure. For this part, I'd argue that more research is needed. The next part is about whether or not the black-white IQ gap is closing.
He says this is on the basis of the work of James Flynn. The problem is that Flynn's purported narrowing is on the basis of renorming samples for IQ tests, right? Which IQ tests use to renorm the baselines for their tests, and renorming samples are not, by design, representative of racial populations.
So, I found a source that says the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which I used to support the closing of the gap, was indeed renormed. The problem here is that it says that renormed means made harder. Due to the Flynn effect, this will cause IQ test norms to become obsolete over time, so they are renormed or made harder to compensate for that. Nowhere does it say that it can't be used for racial IQ comparisons. Where are you getting your information from? You can't just show a title page and then assert things as true. You're good at showing statistics on screen, but not so well when showing a screenshot of text from articles or studies you're getting your information from. It's really concerning. With that being said, my source is still valid.
Also, there's no reason to cherry-pick renorming samples when the totality of IQ tests and proxies for IQ tests like the SAT and the NAEP show no such narrowing. Not that the nominal narrowing of full-scale IQ would even matter, because we don't care about full-scale IQ, we care about G, but that's another topic for another time.
First of all, I'm not cherry-picking if I acknowledge contradicting information. You even played a clip of me saying that if you agree with Charles Murray, you're going to say the gap is not closing. I acknowledge that there are going to be statistics showing no closing gap trend, so don't make empty accusations. Secondly, while the SAT and IQ racial gap statistics you showed didn't close a big deal, it's not a perfect downward slope, but where it stops is less than where it began. Lastly, the NAEP statistic did show a closing gap trend, even more so than the 3 previous statistics. Look at the numbers at the beginning of the video. I may have been wrong about your numbers compared to Rendemann's, but you both show a closing gap. I don't get what you mean by the NAEP showing no such narrowing. Then you belittle this data by saying G is what matters most. You didn't give reasons why, so I can't address that. The next point is about me talking about the NAEP scores showing a closing gap trend.
Let me show you something here. Are you ready? Are you ready? Okay, here it goes. Boop! So both the optimistic and the pessimistic trends that Black Lightning puts up here, these are based on the 2 first test reporting periods. Remove those reporting periods, and there's no trend.
Okay, that was goofy, and you still didn't disprove there being a closing of the gap from 1978 to 2012, so that remains. While there isn't a drastic increase of the IQ score in the later years, it's still an improvement over 1984 and before. Whatever caused that spike increase just needs to be replicated again. To address your use of this to dismiss the pessimistic and optimistic predictions, while it's true for the optimistic prediction, it's not true for the pessimistic prediction. Look closely, the pessimistic prediction is only based on 1992 to 2012, which is why the scores are lower, but it still illustrates the point. If you're thinking they ignored 1986 to 1990, then make up your mind. Is it okay for you to remove years to illustrate your point, or is it just not okay at all? Personally, I think they have accounted for this, and it may not be as simple as you think to throw a wrench into this. I've said in my previous video that I'm unsure if this is reliable, but if true, this is good news for Black people. Please pay attention. Next, you address me talking about Richard Lynn being caught selecting Africans with lower IQ.
Okay, buddy, I'm gonna help you out here. If you want to make the equalist case, you're much better off using Lynn's numbers than Wichard's numbers. Now, I have an article talking about why I prefer Lynn's numbers, because they are more in line with international standardized test scores, and much of Wichard's criticisms of Lynn is that Lynn uses data from African illiterates and people with parasites and people who are stunting and wasting. Lynn's counter to Wichard's, of course, is that these are relevant environmental factors in Black Africa, and so these population samples should not be excluded because they are representative of Africa. But here's why you, Black Lightning, here's why you want a low Black African IQ. You want Lynn's number, which is something like 72, not Wichart's number, which is around 80. Because if the environmental disparity between blacks in Africa and blacks in the US only results in a 5-point gap between US blacks and African blacks, well then what sense does it make to say that the 15-point gap between whites in the US and blacks in the US is down to those orders of magnitude smaller environmental differences between whites in the US and blacks in the US? Think, buddy, think.
I don't argue that everyone is equal in regards to cognitive ability. I argue that there may be differences, and if so, it's not as big of a gap as race realists make it out to be, given the sources I cite. I'm not referring to IQ test scores because I don't think they are perfect measurements of intelligence. Are they useful? Sure, but not perfect. Also, it sure would have been nice to read that article ourselves. Do you care to cite it? You also could have screen captured a text and show it on screen instead of showing a video of people in Africa. Unless you give me enough hints so I can search for the articles you talk about online, I'm not going to waste my time going on wild goose chases to find them. I'll just take what you have to say here with a grain of salt. In regards to what I think about the black-white IQ gap, I don't think African Americans still have the average IQ of 85. Where is it at now? I don't know, but researchers explain that it can rise from 85. Based on new findings and theoretical developments in intelligence, there are good examples of environmental influences on intelligence. I'll pick this one. A study by Fagan and Holland in 2007 studied different samples of blacks and whites and found that whereas black people were substantially lower than white people in the word knowledge, they were equally capable of learning new concepts and making inferences. It may be that knowledge is more influenced by environmental factors than our learning or inferential ability. This result seems to contradict the finding that black people tend to underperform white people on heavily G-loaded tasks, such as Raven's progressive matrices, and it will be interesting to see if it can be replicated. Also, I don't want manipulated numbers from Lynn. I want the truth no matter how good or bad it is. I'm on the side of caution before making strong conclusions in regards to intelligence in certain aspects. The next point you address is the Flynn effect.
The Flynn effect occurs on literally the exact opposite tests that the secular rise in IQ scores occur on. Here's what James Flynn says about the Flynn effect regarding IQ gaps. The magnitude of white-black IQ differences on Wechsler subtests at any given time is correlated with the G-loadings of the subtests. The magnitude of the IQ gains over time on subtests is not usually so correlated. The causes of the two phenomena are not the same. I have acknowledged this many times.
Finally, text! Yes, Flynn did say that, but let's continue, shall we? The authors do not draw the following implications, but for clarity's sake, I wish to make clear that there are certain implications that do not follow. To think that the fact black-white's differences tally with G proves that differences are genetic in origin is a mistake. Flynn analyzes the offspring of children fathered by either blacks and whites during the German occupation after World War II. Whatever subset differences remained had no correlations with the G-loadings of the subsets. I nominate the absence of a black subculture in Germany as a probable factor. The significance of this finding has nothing to do with whether or not there's a genetic component in the black-white IQ difference. There are many confounds that make the German data non-conclusive in this regard. For example, that the black fathers were a mild IQ elite. The point is that while black genes may dictate a racial IQ gap, they do not dictate the G phenomenon. I have the article if you want to read more. I personally don't think black genes play a big role in the IQ gap, but nothing is confirmed about it as of now, but sources hint towards a minimum role, if any. The next point is about whether or not we found the genes responsible for intelligence.
Now what's weird about this is that Black Lightning explained very well, I might add, the concepts of heritability and how heritability is found using twin studies. As it happens, there are studies which look at genes that explain general variation in IQ, and then just use existing genome databases to look at how the frequencies of those genes differ between racial groups.
That statistic you showed came from a source that observed random polygenic scores. Polygenes are genes whose individual effect on phenotype is too small to be observed, but which can act together with others to produce observable variation. It's a PDF file and the source doesn't say anything about race or comparisons between races, so I'll once again take what you have to say with a grain of salt.
And for the variance these genes explain, don't be too concerned with that because explain is not the same as cause, and we don't know if these genes are responsible or if they're just correlated with other genes or if this is all just a big fat coincidence. And so far, there have been no genes found that explain variance in IQ scores that don't vary between the races. Now, finding genes is nice, but you don't have to find the genes.
Yes, you do. My point is that you can't make conclusions based on these genes or say they vary between the races. I'm quite sure if we did find these genes, we could find out how these genes affect intelligence, if the expressions are the same for each race, and whether the genetic base for intelligence is similar between the races or not. This could possibly eliminate errors of attributing the results of environmental factors as genetic in origin.
Black Lightning himself explained how. Now, the general heritability number is enough to just say that the racial groups, unless there's some compelling evidence to show otherwise, the racial gaps are going to be about 80% a result of genetics.
I'm still hesitant to accept the estimates. While I agree that IQ has a genetic component, and heritability of IQ increases with age, I still believe finding the genes responsible for intelligence is very important.
You can say general heritability does not mean the same thing as between group heritability, and sure, that's nice. It doesn't necessarily mean that, because sure, the plants over here could be in different soil, but look, the burden is on you to show that they're in different soil. There's no burden on me to show that they're not in different soil.
The problem here is that I am providing positive claims that the environment of the average black person is not the same as the environment of the average white person. You just dismiss them as myths. You won't take into account of the historical and environmental context brought forth as possible explanations. Try disproving my claims instead of using weak dismissals. When you get to the point where you say bad schools are a myth, then maybe the problem lies with you. The third, last point you address of mine is about brain sizes.
A female IQ gap, or the lack thereof. If he had read Lynn instead of just attacks on Lynn, he would also have the Inuit example to point to as well.
Small nitpick here, and it doesn't matter much, but I got the brain size information from J. Philip P. Rushton. This statistic here is slightly better, but there are a few problems here. The first one is the rather silly correlation between environmental temperatures with brain size and IQ. This is playing off with the Cold-Winters theory, and I already talked about the problems of that theory. Too many assumptions about the selective pressures of thousands of years ago, and trying to use correlations to prove a causation. The next point is South Asians and North Africans count as one race? I would like to see them separated. Also, why couldn't they be region Pacific with Africans? I think it would be highly informative to see West, East, and South African comparisons. Africa doesn't have this one huge environment, so each region should have different selective pressures. If you could find me such data, that would be great. This isn't me shifting goalposts, because even if we took this data as true, it wouldn't be able to explain the majority of the IQ gap. I just want to know if the regions in each continent have an effect on brain size.
And all this is nice, but it doesn't change the general correlation between brain size and IQ. Okay, the general correlation, the argument is just a ceteris paribus, all else being equal, bigger brains are going to have more cognitive function.
Here's another misunderstanding of my position. I said brain size and intelligence are positively correlated. No disagreement there. However, I said brain structure is also important, and experts caution people from making the oversimplified assertion that brain size determines intelligence alone. The two are very important factors to consider.
Makes sense, right? Why wouldn't it? Now, he's wrong about the male-female thing. There is a male-female IQ gap, but it's entirely a product of the gap on visual spatial reasoning, which males have more of.
Okay, but the source you got that statistic from states that is negligible. So my point still stands that we don't know which sex have, on average, an advantage in intelligence. Probably neither. This is just like with race. You're pulling statistics from sources thinking they support you, but you never read the rest of the source for context. I get you like statistics, but they can't give you the full story alone.
He also points out that race differences in brain size only explains about 1.8 IQ points between the races. Sure, maybe, I don't know. I don't care. Francis talked about brain size a lot. I don't. The thing is, there are race differences in brain size, and there are race differences in brain structure, to the point where you can tell the races apart based on the brain structure and the shape of their folds and gyri.
About the cortical surface geometry predicting ancestry, I don't disagree with being able to trace our ancestry based on sampling parts of our biology. However, I should add more context to this by reading parts of the source you got this statistic from. It points out that each racial group tend to have different cranial shapes, which I don't disagree with. That's to be expected. It talks about how they can use this information to explain neuroanatomical and/or neurocranial changes along the human migratory path out of Africa. It says that any functional significance of the cortical surface geometry per se remains to be established. Nevertheless, the causal relationship between observed shapes and crania are beyond the scope of our current study. I also didn't see anything about races having different brain structure because your statistic was about cortical surface being used to identify ancestry. The cortical surface is the area covered by the outer layer of the cerebral cortex. You actually strawmanned me on brain size and brain structure here.
Black Lightning says brain structure is more important than brain size, which is like a really annoying thing to say.
More efficient is not the same as more important. Brain size and brain structure are both informative. Next, you addressed me talking about the Cold Winters theory. I will have to point out that I made a mistake here. I thought agriculture was a recently added condition because of my interactions with race realists prior to you. You're right about me being wrong about that part of the Cold Winters theory, and I should have looked into it more carefully. Even with farming and the colder environments, it still requires a lot of assumptions to make everything fit. I'm still not convinced by it. The last point you addressed was me bringing up the flawed comparison between the average GDP per capita and IQ of black people in America to the average GDP per capita and IQ of entire countries.
Black Lightning went on and on about this. So fine, I got an estimate of per capita GDP purchasing power parity for blacks in the United States based on their median income, which was just then multiplied by the GDP gross national income ratio for the whole of the United States to get basically what the purchasing power parity is roughly going to be for blacks in the United States. Okay, you're going to be plus or minus maybe 500 on this. I then added in some countries that I know have national average IQs above 85, but are poorer than around 35K a year purchasing power parity. And this is just off of memory. This is not a comprehensive list, so here's a bunch of them. So there you have per capita GDP, control for cost of livings for blacks compared to other countries, and their corresponding IQs. He gives the bog standard narrative about slavery and
the point wasn't about the numbers, but the nature of the comparison itself. You can't just compare a subgroup of people in a country to the averages of entire countries. You once again didn't account for different learning environments. It's just a very flawed comparison by nature, and no changes to the numbers can fix that. The rest of the video you insult and mock me. I won't do the same to you because I care about what you have to say and want to address it with care, understanding, and civility. If you believe I misinterpreted your points in this video, please let me know, and I'll make a quick follow-up video addressing that if it's a valid claim. Unlike most race realists I've encountered, you actually have arguments worth addressing, so it would be silly of me to insult you. There's a reason why people turn to you, and I'd be a fool to underestimate you. You have years of experience with this topic. However, you shouldn't underestimate me because I'm not your usual opponents. A race realist called me a borderline race realist in a discussion before. In fact, I've changed a lot to the point if my past self from 2015 when I first discovered this topic were to watch my latest video, he called me a race realist by knee-jerk reaction. But I choose not to identify as such because race isn't important to me and I recognize its flaws and limitations. You overblow the significance of IQ, you rely on assumptions and misinterpretations of sources about genetics, and I think this topic is more divisive than helpful. I want you to address my positions properly so I can grow from it. I can't if you're not doing that. Isn't that what this is all about? To grow as intellectuals? To help one another achieve a better understanding of the world around us? If not, don't bother responding. I declined the live debate because I don't think it will be productive. I just don't like arrogant people, and due to my inexperiences with live debates, I'm going to get nervous and fumble when things get intense. Due to that, you show everyone how you destroyed that race denier. Just watch your video and observe how you addressed my arguments. You were trying too hard to be edgy, which is the parts of the reason why I have to decline. You're going to take that attitude with you. There are good and honest race realists who, despite our disagreements, never treated me the way you and most of your followers did to me. Another reason why I prefer a video response is because I can take my time to address you properly and read your sources. There wouldn't be time for that during a live debate. Even if you showed me your sources beforehand, I'll have to check during the debate if you say something about a source that doesn't add up to me. It's going to be slow and stretch for hours, while a video response ranges from half an hour to an hour. People are not going to have the patience for a video spanning hours long, and they'll walk away thinking the person they already agree with destroyed the other person. Take it from the person who made a 3-hour video. I learned my lesson. I can consider a live conversation with a well-mannered race realist if I have the time, but not with you. You have some things you need to work on. No hard feelings, and I'm trying to be as nice as I can. I'm sorry if you took offense to anything I've said in this video or my teasing of you in the previous video. Although I think my teasing was tasteful and lighthearted, but you could have taken it the wrong way, so I want to apologize. This is your chance to help change my perception of you in the future, because right now, I think you're going to double down on being edgy and never admit to any of your mistakes. But please prove me wrong. If you could change how you address me, that can easily put you in a positive light. And I will not only respect your right to disagree with me, but I'll also respect you as a person. Anyways, thanks for watching and take care.